3 gun hands on horseback, and that would cost Dell Merrick everything. Bandera County, Texas, early spring of 1883, and a young widow named Cora Vance was about to hire the last man on earth those riders wanted between them and her water. Her name was Cora, and she was 27 years old. Stay with this. By the time I finish telling you what happened that spring in the Nueces hill country, you will understand why her name still gets spoken in Bandera County with a particular kind of weight, the weight that attaches to people who made something out of next to nothing when everything was arranged against them. I was a young man when I first heard this story, from an old fella who had worked the Vance place the spring after all of it happened. I have been carrying it for a long time. It has taken me this long to find the right place to tell it. The country itself is part of the story, so let me put you there first. The Nueces River Hill country southwest of Bandera, Texas, in 1883 was a land of white limestone bluffs and shallow cedar breaks, and the kind of sky that seemed, in early spring, to be deciding whether it was going to give you rain or deny you for another month. The creeks ran thin that year, still recovering from a dry winter, and the grass came in pale and reluctant across the ridge pastures. The river itself was down to a quarter of its ordinary width by February. Out in the breaks above town, water was not merely a comfort, it was the arithmetic of survival. Who had it determined what lived and what didn't, what cattle made it to market weight, and what cattle you fed through summer on borrowed feed until the money ran out? Dell Merrick had understood that arithmetic longer and better than anyone else in the county, and he had been acting on his understanding for the better part of 15 years. He was 61 years old in the spring of 1883, a trim man who kept himself in good boots and pressed clothes and conducted himself with the measured, unhurried manner of someone who has never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He had been acquiring water rights in the southwest quarter of the county since the late 1870s, one deed at a time, one squeeze at a time, patient and systematic as the drought itself. By that spring, he controlled 4 of the 7 main springs that fed the lower pastures, and the 3 he didn't control were the only things in the county that still interested him. 2 of those 3 belonged to small outfits that had already started buckling under the sustained pressure of his attention. The 3rd was the Vance claim. 80 acres of limestone rangeland fronting Coyote Creek, and the 2 springs that fed it, deeded originally to Thomas Vance in 1879. Thomas Vance had been a decent, industrious man who came to the hill country from central Missouri with some savings and a solid plan and more optimism than the country rewarded. He had gotten far enough to fence the lower pasture and start a modest herd before the fever caught him in the February of 1882 and took him in 11 days. He left behind the land, the deed, 11 head of cattle, a milk cow, a gray mule, 4 laying hens, a well house with a failing roof, and a tin under the kitchen floorboard containing $112. He left behind as well his wife of 4 years. Cora. She had come to Texas from Louisiana at 22, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a practical mother who had raised her to be capable first and decorative later, an order of priorities that served her well in the hill country and would serve her better now. She was not what the frontier paperback novels meant when they wrote about frontier women, not delicate, not prone to useful fainting, not waiting on the arrival of male rescue. She was 27 with light brown hair she kept pinned up because she had work to do, and her hands were already the hands of someone who had been doing it. She rose before the rooster every morning, and she kept accounts in a ledger by lamplight at night, and she made decisions about the cattle and the fence and the water with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She had one hired man, a Mexican named Eusebio, who was 63 years old and had worked for Thomas since the second year, and who walked with a pronounced limp from a mule kick he'd taken before Cora arrived. Eusebio was good with cattle and better with horses, and knew the property as well as anyone alive. But he was 63 and lame, and the physical work of maintaining the place had been falling increasingly to Cora in the 14 months since Thomas died. She had not complained about this. She was not a complainer. She had budgeted carefully, fixed what she could fix herself, put off what could be put off, and quietly calculated what she would need to do in the coming year to keep the operation from sliding backward. She had a plan for the upper pasture, and a plan for the herd, and a plan for the well house roof. She needed one more decent year to get enough cash in front of her to execute those plans. What she got instead was 3 riders at her gate at 5 in the morning on a Thursday in April. The one who did the talking was a man named Orson Plute, and he was the particular kind of man who is worse than the dramatically bad kind. Worse than the kind who arrives loud and obvious and lets you know immediately what you're dealing with. Plute arrived pleasant. He had a wide, plain face and small eyes that didn't settle anywhere long enough to mean anything, and his manner was the manner of a man performing courtesy as a technical requirement of a job he found straightforward. He produced a letter bearing what appeared to be Thomas Vance's signature from a firm connected to Merrick's attorney, claiming Thomas had incurred a debt before his death. The letter proposed that Cora could settle the alleged debt by signing over the water rights, or alternatively suffer the unpleasantness of legal proceedings. He was patient about explaining all of this. Very patient. The particular patience of a man who has explained the same thing to other people in other doorways and knows how it goes. The man beside him was Chet Dunbar. Dunbar was the kind of drunk who moved in cycles, pleasant enough through most of a morning, progressively less reliable through the afternoon, and by evening a genuinely different creature than the man who had woken up. He had beaten a Mexican sheepherder half to death over a card game the previous October, a game in which Dunbar had been the one with extra cards in his palm. The sheepherder was still eating soft food. Dunbar had faced no charges. That was the nature of the county. The third rider was a young man named Ellis Boone, red-headed and eager, whose fundamental problem was that he wanted desperately to be admired. By Plute, by Dunbar, by the other hands in the Merrick bunkhouse. He had come on this particular errand because Plute had suggested he was ready for it, and that endorsement alone had been enough to bring him. He was not a bad young man at his foundation. He would demonstrate that later in the moment that mattered. Cora took the letter and held her lantern up and read it in the gray pre-dawn light. She read the signature twice. She had seen Thomas Vance's signature on the original deed, on his letters, on the household account ledger she still kept, and on 4 years' worth of other documents. She was familiar with the shape of it. She lowered the lantern and looked at Plute for a moment. She gave him the letter back, without a word, went inside, and bolted the door. She sat at the kitchen table for an hour in the dark, while Eusebio built the morning fire, and she thought. She was a practical woman, more practical even than Thomas had been, and right now practicality was delivering her a message she did not want to receive, that the resources available to her, 1 woman, 1 aging hired man, 11 head of cattle, and $112 in a tin, were not the resources required to fight Dell Merrick. Not in Bandera County. The sheriff was a Merrick appointment. The bank held a Merrick note. The men who might have been willing to stand alongside her had been bought or quieted, one by one, over years. What she needed was someone who existed outside that system. She had until the end of the month to find one. She went to the ledger that evening and ran the numbers she already knew. The way you run numbers you already know when you need the act of running them to clarify your thinking. The cattle were worth something, but not enough. The mule and the milk cow together would not cover a month of legal fees. The springs themselves were worth more than everything else combined. That was the whole of the problem. If she sold them, she would have money and no future. If she kept them and lost the fight, she would have neither. The only way through was a fight that didn't cost her more than she had, and that required help she didn't have to pay for, or that she could pay for later. And neither of those things was easy to find in a county that was effectively Merrick's property. She put the ledger away and went to bed and lay awake longer than she intended to. She rode the 4 miles into Bandera 3 days later and went to see Horace Pittman, who had drafted the original Vance deed and who was, as far as she knew, the most honest lawyer in Bandera County, which in 1883 was not a field with much competition. Pittman was a careful man, careful in the way you become careful when you are honest, and operating in a county that mostly punishes honesty. And he looked at the debt letter with the close attention of a man who does not want to make a mistake in either direction. He looked at it for a long time. He compared it to the 2 Thomas Vance documents he kept in his own files. He took his spectacles off and then put them back on. Then he put the letter down on his desk. In his professional view, he had a forgery in front of him. The signature was close, but not right. There were 3 letter forms that didn't match Thomas Vance's authentic documents on file. Cora had every legal right to contest the debt letter. Contesting it in Bandera County, given the arrangement of things, would cost her most of what was in the tin, and would not guarantee a favorable result. And furthermore, he was gentle about this part. 2 Merrick riders had been past his office 3 times the previous week, on no apparent business. She thanked him for his time and paid his consultation fee and walked out to the street. She was at her mule's hitching ring, pulling the loop free, when she noticed the man on the steps of the feed store across the road. He was drinking coffee from a tin cup, both hands around it, watching the street the way a man watches something that has no connection to him. He was lean and long-legged, in trail-worn clothes, canvas coat, brown trousers, boots that had been resoled at least once. His gun rode his left hip in a plain holster with no marking on it. He had several days' worth of beard on a face that was not remarkable in any single feature, but that you kept looking at without being able to account for why. When his eyes crossed hers from across the road, they were the steady particular gray of a sky about to change weather. He didn't look away. He didn't stare exactly. He looked the way a man looks when he is doing something quiet and deliberate inside himself. She crossed the road. Her feet made that choice before her thinking did. She stood at the bottom of those steps and explained, in the direct, efficient way she handled most things, that she needed a line rider for the spring, someone to watch her cattle and sleep in the bunkhouse at $15 a month and board. She wasn't sure why she was making this pitch to a stranger on the steps of a feed store. He didn't carry the look of a man hunting for work. He had the look of a man between things, which was a different kind of available. He finished his coffee. He stood without hurrying. He would start that afternoon. His name, he said, was Amos. No last name came with it, and she did not press for one. That was not unusual in those hills in those years, Men moved, and they moved for reasons, and the reasons were their business, unless they gave you cause to make it yours. What Cora didn't know, what no one in Bandera County could have known, was that this man had worked very carefully for 2 years to make sure his last name meant nothing in the places he passed through. That in 3 territories and 2 states, among men who ran certain kinds of operations, the name Amos Crail carried a very specific weight. Not the weight of celebrity or legend in the storybook sense. The weight of a very precise and documented record. 12 situations, 11 of which had gone very badly for the other parties. The 12th had not gone badly because the other party recognized the name in time and changed direction. He was 31 years old. He had been a cattle hand, a scout, a deputy marshal in New Mexico Territory for 4 years, and other things before those that he did not recount for anyone. He had walked into situations that should have killed him, and had walked back out, consistently, leaving behind a level of ruin that tended to generate stories, because the men who witnessed it were not the type who exaggerated. The stories that accumulated around him were of the kind that circulate among professionals, men who hire themselves out to violent work, men who employ that kind of hiring, in the specific register of useful information. Not legend exactly. Calibration. A way of knowing, before the thing happened, what you were actually dealing with, so you could make a rational decision about whether to proceed. He had ridden south out of New Mexico 6 weeks earlier with no planned destination, sleeping rough, doing odd work at various outfits, staying nowhere long enough for anything to become familiar. He had been working, with some deliberateness, at being done with the other kind of life. The deliberateness was necessary because the pull of it was real, not the violence which he had never found satisfying, but the clarity of it. When things were wrong in a measurable way, and you had the capacity to make them right, there was a particular pull to acting on that. He understood the pull. He had been trying to resist it for 2 years. Not because it was wrong exactly, but because the cost of following it was the cost of being only that thing, and he was tired of being only that thing. He had not known, sitting on those steps, that today was the day he was going to stop. He loaded his bedroll on the mule and walked beside her on the Bandera Road, and she walked him through the layout of the place, the cattle and the range and the bunkhouse and Eusebio and the east fence that needed work. She did not mention Merrick or the letter. She wasn't ready to put that in front of a stranger yet. She needed a few days first. He listened and asked a measured question or two about the upper pasture and the approach to the east fence line. Nothing else. He could wait. Before we go further, if you are new to this channel, I want to stop here and ask you to subscribe. It is free and it helps this channel more than most people know. And I genuinely want to know, where are you tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment. I read every one of them. Let us get back to Cora and Amos now. Things are about to turn. She watched him the first few days with the particular attention of a person who has had to learn quickly how to read people because reading them wrong has consequences. Her late husband Thomas had been an open book. His face told you everything he was thinking at any given moment, which she had loved about him. This man was the opposite. Not hidden exactly, just very still. He did not offer things about himself. He did not make conversation for its own sake. When he had something to say, he said it, and when he did not, he was quiet, and both of those states had a similar quality of completeness about them, as if silence and speech were equally acceptable to him, and he chose between them on strictly practical grounds. She could not find anything wrong with his work. That was its own kind of information. He fixed what was broken and did not create new breakages in the fixing. He treated the cattle and the mule with the easy competence of someone who has known animals his whole life, and understands that patience with them is more efficient than force. Eusebio, she noticed, had started leaving him the better horse to use in the mornings, which was a form of assessment from Eusebio that meant something. The first week passed without incident. Amos rode the fence lines twice daily and repaired 3 sections of wire that had been let go to rust and lean. He moved the cattle to the upper pasture where the spring grass was coming in stronger. He disassembled the Winchester in the bunkhouse, the one that hadn't fired in 2 years because the action had gummed over with old oil, and cleaned it back to working order and put it together again. He rose before first light, ate what Cora left for him in the bunkhouse, washed his own plate. He did not talk much. Eusebio watched him with the slow, careful attention of a man who has categorized many kinds of men over 63 years and was still working out where this one went. At the end of the first week, on a Friday evening, Cora came out to where Amos was working the east fence and put the whole situation in front of him. Merrick and the letter and Pittman's reading of it, and the 3-rider visit, and the deadline at the end of the month. She laid it out the way she laid everything out. Facts in sequence. No dramatizing. Nothing in it that was asking him to feel something about it. Just the shape of the problem. He listened without breaking his work. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, hands on the fence wire. The letter, he said, flat and even, it sounded like a forgery. It was Pittman's view as well, she said. He stayed quiet a moment longer. Then he wanted to know the structure of Merrick's position in the county, specifically which offices and institutions he controlled. She laid that out, too. The sheriff, the bank, 2 of the 3 county commissioners, the major ranches that voted with him, the land office clerk who had been placed there by a Merrick appointment. 15 years of architecture. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when you are filing information rather than agreeing with it. He said that a legitimate deed and a provable forgery were strong ground, but that strong ground filed in a county this man controlled was not going to hold. What she needed was a record outside his reach. He said he had a thought about how to make one. He would let her know. She looked at him for a moment, this man crouched over a cedar fence post in the last of the afternoon light, who had been on her payroll for 6 days and was already thinking further down the road than she was. Then she went back to the house. Eusebio, watching from the kitchen doorway, kept whatever he was thinking entirely to himself, which was characteristic of him and was its own form of commentary. On the following Tuesday, Cora believed Amos had ridden into Bandera for wire and flour. He had ridden to Bandera, and he had purchased the wire and the flour. He had also ridden past Bandera and continued another 38 miles east to Kerrville, the county seat of Kerr County, which had no political connection to Dell Merrick, and which sat far enough outside the practical orbit of Bandera County affairs to be, in the relevant ways, a different world. He spent 4 hours in Kerrville. The previous evening, he had borrowed the Vance water deed from Cora's strongbox, a 4-minute operation, in and out, while she was in the barn, and had returned it before dawn the following morning. In Kerrville, he met with a notary unconnected to Bandera County affairs, and with the county recorder's office. He filed a certified copy of the Vance water deed, and alongside it, a sworn affidavit he had drafted for Horace Pittman, and that Pittman had signed earlier that week, attesting that the debt letter produced by Merrick's attorney bore a signature inconsistent with Thomas Vance's authentic documents on file. The filing specified that any legal challenge to the recorded material be routed through Cora County jurisdiction. He rode back with the wire and the flour. He knew how to do this because of those 4 years as a deputy in New Mexico Territory. He had learned a particular lesson in that work, the same lesson repeatedly and in different forms. That force was a temporary protection, that it escalated, and that the most durable protection available to a civilian inside a corrupted district was a documented record in a jurisdiction the corrupt party couldn't reach. You put the paper somewhere it couldn't be burned. Then you let the other party know the paper existed. What they decided to do with that information was their own business. But it changed their calculation. It changed what the job cost. And when the job got expensive enough, most men doing it on another man's behalf did a calculation of their own. He had not told Cora what he had done, and he would not until the time was right. The time would be right when she needed the information, and she didn't need it yet. She needed to not know it yet, so that whatever showed on her face in the next encounter with Merrick's men was genuine and unguarded. A woman who doesn't know she has a card doesn't play it early. That had value. Something else had happened that week that he had also not relayed to her. On Monday, at the Bandera dry goods counter, he had felt the quality of attention arriving before he could locate its source. The particular awareness you develop when people have looked for you before, and you have learned what it feels like from the other side. He turned and found a heavy man of about 50 at the far end of the counter, a deputy's star on his coat, whose name turned out to be Foss. Foss moved over in a way that was professionally pleasant. He was curious whether Amos was passing through or staying local. He thought maybe he had seen Amos somewhere before, couldn't pin it down. El Paso, maybe. Amos acknowledged being in El Paso at various points. Foss went quiet for a moment. The look on his face was the look of a man doing arithmetic while holding his expression still. Amos waited, reading that moment precisely, the way he had learned to read it across 12 iterations. This was the hinge. It went one way or the other here. Foss, low and without drama, made it known that Merrick paid his salary, and that if a man named Amos Crail happened to be working the Vance place, Merrick would want to know about it. He did not inflect it as a question. Amos said he had never in his life heard of anyone by that name, paid for what he had, and walked out. He rode the 4 miles back at a steady pace, watching the landscape. He had somewhere between a week and 2 weeks before Foss chose a direction, and the county's gravity made the likely direction clear, which meant Cora's formal deadline, the end of the month, was not the real deadline. The real deadline was whenever Merrick got Foss's assessment and decided to act on it. He spent 2 nights working through the geometry of what came next. He had been trying to be done with this. He wanted to be clear with himself about what was happening here, because he had been in the situation before, of not being clear with himself about it and paying for the unclarity afterward. He had spent 2 years moving through the country without stopping, not because he had nowhere to go, but because stopping led to this, the moment where a situation presented itself and his particular set of capabilities was the nearest available tool, and the weight of what was right pressed on one side, and the weight of his own exhaustion pressed on the other. He knew why he was still on this property. He was not fooling himself. He had crossed that road in Bandera to sit on those steps, and she had crossed the road to stand at the bottom of them, and he had started his bedroll moving before his thinking caught up. He understood the reason. He also understood that the reason didn't change the job. He spent 2 nights working through the geometry of what came next. The property had 4 main approach angles, and 9 men, which he estimated as the likely number, based on what Cora had relayed about Merrick's outfit, would probably split across 2 of them. The house was the obvious target, and the cattle were the secondary target. A sensible operation would try to handle both simultaneously. A sensible operation would also probe the property at night first, which was standard and which Amos had already anticipated. The preparation he did on the following day would not have been obvious to a casual observer. He walked the perimeter of the property again, this time reading it for approach angles rather than fence condition. He identified where mounted men would naturally come through in darkness, where the ground was reliable under a horse's foot, and where it wasn't, where the terrain offered concealment, and where it left a man exposed. He found 3 positions with clean sight lines on the main approaches. He placed a series of small objects in those positions. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible unless you were looking that would produce noise when disturbed in the dark. At the gate he graded a section of ground into a subtle slope and dressed it with loose shale so that any horse moving through at speed would find its footing uncertain. He cached a second rifle in the well house and made sure the barrel was clean. He filled the water barrel behind the house. He examined the corral gate chain and calculated what a single round, at the range from the water tank, would do to it in darkness. He was thorough about all of this. He had done this kind of work before. He did not find it satisfying. He found it necessary. The difference between those 2 things mattered to him. A man who found this kind of preparation satisfying was a different kind of man, and he had known that kind. And they tended to end up in places and circumstances that made a cautionary example of them. He prepared because the alternative was leaving Cora with nothing between her and 9 men in the dark, and that was not something he was willing to do. On the second evening after supper, he sat with Cora on the back step and worked with her on the rifle. She had some experience from Thomas, enough to load it and point it, but not the kind of mechanical confidence you develop from repetition. He was a good teacher in the way you become a good teacher when everything you know came from having to learn it under pressure. He kept the instructions spare. He corrected the position of her cheek on the stock. He talked about breath and about the specific patience of letting the front sight settle before your finger moves. He had her dry fire at a cedar post 30 yards across the pasture until the motion was in her hands rather than her head. Then they loaded it and she put 3 rounds into the dusk. The first was wide by 2 feet. The second was close. The third clipped the post. She lowered the rifle and looked at the post. He had her do it again. She put 3 more rounds into the evening. 2 clipped the post. 1 took the knot off the top of it. He said that would do. She brought the rifle down. She stood there in the fading light for a moment, and her face had something in it that wasn't quite pride, something quieter. The look of a person who has just discovered a capability that was already in them, and is deciding what to do with the knowledge. It was the same look she sometimes had when she solved a problem with the fence or the cattle that she had been working around for a week, a kind of still recognition. She wanted to know where he had come from. Before Bandera. She put the question directly. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. Not the quiet of a man formulating a lie, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of the true thing to put into words, which is a different silence entirely. New Mexico, he said, looking out across the darkening pasture. Before that, Colorado. Before that, places he didn't particularly account for. She waited. He had been a deputy marshal for 4 years, he continued, still watching the pasture. Before that, cattle work. Before that, things he didn't enjoy going over. She heard the past tense on all of it, not regret exactly, but the finished quality of someone describing a country they used to live in and had left deliberately, the tone of someone who had closed a door and was not discussing what was on the other side of it. She knew better than to push on it. Some roads you can hear ending before you reach the end of them. She went inside. He stayed on the back step for a long while in the dark, watching the cedar line and listening to the creek. The night air carried the smell of cedar and dry limestone, and the faint sweetness of the spring grass coming in on the upper pasture. He had been in the hill country before, years ago, and had always found something in the particular quality of the dark out here that was different from other dark, denser somehow, as if the land held the night closer. He sat with it until he was sure of what he heard and what he didn't, and then he went to the bunkhouse. The riders came on a Wednesday, 3 hours before dawn, 9 of them. Merrick had been patient for 15 years, and now he was done. The operation was practical and impersonal. Merrick had not run it himself. He rarely did. But the instructions were his, communicated to Plute the previous afternoon, in the measured, unhurried way Merrick communicated most things. The goal was not drama. The goal was reduction. Cut the upper wire, scatter the cattle into the cedar, where rounding them up would take days and cost money Cora didn't have. Break or burn the well house. Run the mule off. Leave the operation in a state that could not be recovered before the end of the month, so that when the deadline arrived, the only rational decision remaining to her was to sell. Merrick had done this before. It worked because it left the person with no ground to stand on, and a person with no ground to stand on will eventually accept whatever terms are offered just to have something solid under their feet again. Plute took 4 men around the north fence line to cut the upper wire and scatter the cattle into the cedar break. Dunbar took 4, including Boone, directly up the road toward the house. Dunbar's group reached the gate first. The leading horse moved through the gate and immediately found its footing going sideways, the slope and the shale doing exactly what they had been arranged to do. The horse corrected without going down, but it made noise doing it, and it checked the rider hard, and by the time the rider had control again, the gate was effectively blocked, and the 3 men behind had bunched in the road. The voice came out of the dark from above and to the left, from the direction of the water tank on the east side of the yard. It was impossible to locate with any precision. Level and conversational in its register. It covered the following ground in approximately 90 seconds. The Vance water deed was legitimate. The debt letter carried a forged signature. Horace Pittman's sworn affidavit identifying the forgery was on record with the Kerr County recorder, alongside a certified copy of the original Vance deed. The filing was under Kerr County jurisdiction. Any damage to structures or people on the Vance property that night would result in documentation forwarded to the Kerr County Sheriff's Office within 2 days. And then, nobody there needed to die tonight. And then, Merrick's men ought to think carefully about whether Merrick's business was worth what it was going to cost them. Complete silence. Dunbar was running the calculation. He had been in bad situations and was not a man who scared quickly. He was trying to locate that voice. He could see the edge of the water tank. He could not see a foot past it. There was no moon. Amos had chosen the night with that fact in mind. Then the shot cracked out across the yard. The chain on the corral gate 60 feet from where Dunbar sat his horse, dropped into the dirt. One round, in that darkness, through the link. Ellis Boone's voice, very quiet. "That's Amos Crail." The name moved through the four men the way fire moves through dry cedar, not with sound, just fast. Dunbar knew it. He had been in Amarillo in 1880 and had heard from sources he had reason to trust the account of four men with serious professional reputations who had decided collectively that Amos Crail was one man and could be handled. Those four men had not handled him. That account had traveled through the panhandle in the particular register reserved for things that actually happened and could not be reduced to exaggeration. Dunbar turned his horse. The three men with him turned. They rode back up the road in the dark, not running. Running would have been an admission, but not idling either. On the north side of the property, Plute heard the shot and the silence that followed it. He waited. He heard nothing else except after some time the soft sound of horses moving away. Plute was a man who processed information efficiently. He brought his group back around without engaging. Cora had been behind the wellhouse door with the rifle for more than an hour before any of this happened, exactly where Amos had placed her before full dark. She had stood in the dark of the well house listening to her own heartbeat for a while before the sounds came, and the waiting had been harder than she expected. Not the fear exactly, though the fear was present and real. The harder thing was the waiting itself, the stillness required of her, the discipline of not moving when every instinct in her said that motion was better than standing still in the dark while things happened outside. She gripped the rifle and kept her breath even, and she waited. She heard the shale at the gate. She heard his voice from a direction she could not pin down in the dark. She heard the shot. She heard the silence. She heard horses leaving. She waited the additional 10 minutes he had specified, every minute of it. Then she pushed the wellhouse door open and walked out. He was at the water tank with his rifle across his arm, watching the road. He had not moved from there. His posture was the posture of a man who had been in that exact position for a long time and was not particularly tired from it. She walked up. She stood beside him for a moment without speaking, looking at the road. The road was empty, and the night was deep, and the cedar was very still. "The chain," she said. He would fix it in the morning. She had heard a name, she said, before they turned around. One of the men had spoken it. He didn't answer immediately. She was not a person who worked around things. She wanted to know, straight, whether Amos Crail was a name she needed to have an understanding of. He was quiet for a moment. It was a name he had carried for some years, he said, and one he had no particular attachment to. It was useful in the way it had just been useful. The reputation arrived before you, and sometimes that was enough, and you didn't have to do much else. He held her look, level in the dark. The filing in Kerrville was real, he said. He had made the trip himself, borrowed the deed from her strongbox the Tuesday night before the supply run, and returned it before she was up. It was on record. Whatever Merrick moved on next, there was now something outside his reach. She was still for a moment. She took in the information about the deed, that he had borrowed it without her knowing, filed it under her protection in a jurisdiction outside Merrick's reach, and returned it to her strongbox before she was up, all without a word to her about any of it. That he had ridden 84 miles round trip on his own initiative and his own time, because it was the right thing to do, and the capability was his, and that was apparently enough reason. She looked at the road a while longer, and while she looked at it she was thinking about something that she did not put into words that night and did not put into words for some time after. She was thinking about the particular kind of man who goes to 84 miles of trouble on someone else's behalf, in secret, without being asked, because it is the right thing to do and the capability is available to him. She had known men who would describe themselves in those terms, and almost none of them actually were those terms. This one was. That was not nothing. Then she went inside. He stayed at the water tank for another hour, watching the cedar line until he was satisfied, then walked back to the bunkhouse and sat in the dark, listening to the property settle. Merrick had Plute's account by Thursday morning. He received it in the same still-focused way he received information that required careful handling. He knew the name. He had 61 years in the business of acquiring things, and he had accumulated along the way a working knowledge of the types of men who moved through the territory. Amos Crail was not a problem you addressed with an escalating number of men. That was not the shape of the solution. More men would change nothing about the arithmetic. He sent Plute to Kerrville on Friday to verify. Plute came back Saturday afternoon with what he had found. The deed copy and the Pittman affidavit were on record with the county clerk, filed under the name Amos Crail, with a notation establishing Kerr County jurisdiction for any challenge. Plute had obtained a copy of the affidavit. The language was specific, attributing the forgery with precision and without hedging. Merrick read it. He put it on his desk. He looked at it. The forgery had been Plute's initiative, done in the belief that Merrick would approve, and in a county where Merrick's approval was the same as authorization. Merrick had let it stand because it was useful, and because he had not anticipated it being exposed beyond his reach. The Kerrville filing had changed the exposure entirely. He could not touch that recorder. He could not discredit Pittman. Amos Crail was not a problem his operation was equipped to resolve. He sat with all of this through Saturday. The Vance water rights were valuable. But the Delgado Springs 2 miles north were held by an aging sheep herder who had been indicating a willingness to consider an offer. The Delgado Springs would do. The Vance claim was now contested in 2 counties, and by a man whose name carried specific weight even to men accustomed to using force professionally. The cost of continuing to press the Vance situation had increased substantially. The benefit had not changed at all. On Saturday evening, Merrick wrote a letter to Cora Vance. It was careful and formal, and written entirely in the passive voice. It referred to an administrative error in the previous correspondence and extended the assurance that she should disregard the earlier documentation. It wished her well on the Vance claim. Plute read it before it went out. He had worked for Merrick for 6 years. He had forged the deed, ridden at 5 in the morning to frighten a widow, and spent considerable effort building the architecture of an operation designed to take something that did not belong to him. Reading the letter, he understood with complete clarity that the administrative error referred to in the letter was him, and that he was now the designated explanation for everything that had gone wrong, and that his position inside the Merrick organization had just ended. He left Bandera County within the week. His whereabouts were not established when the civil action in Kerr County came to its conclusion in September. Merrick's letter arrived at the Vance place on Monday morning. It was delivered by the same post rider who had brought the original debt notice, which was an irony she registered and kept to herself. Cora read it at the kitchen table, read it again, put it down. She sat with it for a moment. She had a schoolteacher's daughter's relationship with language, which meant she read for what was absent from words as much as what was present in them. What was absent from Merrick's letter was any admission, any name for what had happened. The words it used were administrative error and wrong correspondence and the passive voice throughout, the voice of a man who has decided the event will be described as a regrettable malfunction rather than an intentional crime. She understood what that meant. A man who exits in the passive voice is a man who is not finished, only recalculating. She went to the kitchen door and looked out at the yard where Amos was at the east corner post, the one that had been leaning since she hired him, and that he had simply been working his way toward. She called out to him, and he came in. She put the letter on the table. He read it standing up without sitting down. He put it back on the table. She wanted to know what it meant in real terms. He said it meant Merrick had decided she wasn't worth it anymore. Not that she was permanently safe. Worth it was always a moving number, but that the immediate danger was behind her. The Kerrville record put a real legal cost on any further direct action. The account of what had happened Wednesday night would circulate through Merrick's organization, and some of those men would start doing their own arithmetic about what they were doing and what it was worth to them personally. Plut's exposure made his position in that organization untenable in ways that would resolve themselves in Plut's departure. None of it was permanent. But it was real, and it would hold. She poured coffee. She set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table in the morning light. She had something to tell him about her plans, she said, and she wanted to say it straight because he had earned that. She was staying on the Vance claim. She was going to rebuild the herd, fence the upper pasture right, replace the well house roof, and make the place into what Thomas had planned it to be, which was a working cattle outfit, and not just a piece of land with a deed attached. She was going to need help she could not presently pay for, beyond their existing arrangement, for the next several months. She was not asking him to stay out of obligation. She was putting the shape of things in front of him so he could decide with full information. He had both hands around the coffee cup. He looked at her across the table. Something happened on his face, not a smile, not quite, but a particular small rearrangement that had never appeared on it in the weeks she had known him. He could stay through summer, he said, if that suited her. It suited her, she said. They did not say anything else about it. That was the nature of what it was between them, not declared, not pressed, held carefully in both hands, like something discovered rather than constructed, and that both of them understood could be made fragile by being too definite about it too soon. I will tell you how it ended, as best as the record and the old man's account give me to work with. Amos stayed through July. In those 3 months, the Vance place was transformed in the way a property gets transformed when someone who knows what they are doing applies consistent effort to it with the intention of staying. The upper pasture got fenced right, the new wires strung tight, and the posts set deep enough in the limestone to last another decade. The well house roof went from failing to solid. The herd grew with 2 calves dropped in June, healthy animals, good weight by fall standards. The corral got a new gate to replace the one whose chain had been shot through, a heavier gate this time. And Amos hung it himself on a Tuesday morning, while Eusebio supervised from the fence rail and offered commentary in Spanish about the relative merits of different kinds of hinge hardware. Eusebio's back got some relief when a young hired boy came on from Bandera in late June to take the heavier lifting. The boy was 14 and serious about his work in the way some young people are serious, as though they have decided that competence is a form of dignity, and they intend to have both. He had the good sense to watch Amos and Eusebio before doing things, which was more than could be said for some grown men who hired on at places and assumed they already knew everything. By August, the place had gotten something back that places get when people who mean to stay are taking care of them, a kind of presence that was different from the presence of a place merely being maintained. The cattle had learned the new fence lines. The grass in the upper pasture was coming in thicker than it had in years. Cora was writing in the account ledger again with numbers that were moving in the right direction. In late July, Amos told Cora he needed to ride north for a while. There was something he had to attend to. He would likely be back by fall. She looked at him with the look of a woman who has learned to read the distance between likely and yes, and she said fall was fine. She did not ask what needed attending to. Some things belong to a person alone, and asking about them changes nothing and costs something. She understood that about him. He rode out at first light on a Saturday in late July. She stood at the gate, not waving, just watching. Eusebio stood behind her in the yard. The old man who relayed this to me had taken work in Uvalde by then, and lost the thread of what happened in Bandera County after that summer. He did not know whether Amos came back in the fall, but he said something I have returned to more times than I can count. He said that in his experience, men who rode away from something good and quiet did it for one of two reasons. Either the quiet reminded them too precisely of what they had already lost, and the only way to stand being reminded of it was to keep moving. Or they were out there in the space between, doing something that needed to be done before they could come back to something worth coming back to. He said he had known enough of both kinds to distinguish them. He was clear about which kind of riding this was. I believe he had it right. As for the record where records exist, the Kerr County civil action of September 1883 found against Merrick's operation, establishing in the public record that fraudulent documentation had been used as an instrument of land acquisition. The language was careful, as such language always is, but the meaning was not ambiguous to anyone who read it. Orson Plute was not located for the proceeding. Chet Dunbar died in November outside Uvalde from causes consistent with prolonged heavy drink. Ellis Boone left the Merrick operation after the Wednesday night event at the Vance Gate and went into ranch work in the country west of San Antonio, where by available account he was a steady hand who showed up when he was supposed to and didn't cause trouble. People turn out better than their circumstances sometimes. Boone was one of those. Dell Merrick died in his bed in 1887. Not violently. He got old and sick, and that was it, which is neither the ending the dramatic version of this story would write, nor the ending most people who knew him would have chosen for him, and which may in fact be the most accurate possible reflection of how these things actually go. His operation passed to heirs who had less talent for it, and within 5 years the whole architecture, 15 years of careful accumulation, was substantially reduced. These arrangements depend so heavily on the specific man who builds them that they rarely survive him cleanly. The Vance water rights were never challenged again. I have thought about Cora Vance across many years and what she made of what was handed to her. I think most often about that morning in Bandera when she crossed the road to the steps of the feed store. She did not have to do that. She could have gotten back on her mule and tried a different approach and avoided the exposure of asking a stranger for help. She didn't. That is not a small thing. In that time and country, women were not encouraged to treat the asking of help as anything other than a declaration of defeat. Cora Vance was not afraid of defeat in the ordinary sense. She had already experienced more loss than most people accumulate in their whole lives, and she had kept going. What she had was something rarer than courage, which is the willingness to try a new direction when the old one has run out. She had that. And she had the instinct, good luck or good judgment, call it what you like, to stand at the bottom of those steps and say the honest thing to a man she had no earthly reason to trust. That instinct alone did not save the Vance claim, but it put the right person in the right place at the moment it mattered, and sometimes that is the entirety of what saving requires. The Nueces hill country in the spring of 1883 was the kind of country that did not care whether you made it or not. The land was hard and the water scarce, and the law was whoever had enough money to purchase it. A widow alone on 80 acres with a forged debt letter against her name and 11 head of cattle and a lame hired man had very little on paper. What Cora Vance demonstrated across that spring and into that summer was that paper was not the whole story. Not when the woman holding the deed had that particular combination of nerve and practicality and the willingness to cross the road. This is a work of fiction. The characters, events, and locations depicted in this story are products of imagination, drawn from the spirit and historical period of the American frontier. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is coincidental. This story was crafted with the assistance of AI storytelling tools. If you stayed with us all the way to the end, thank you. That means everything to a channel like this one. Leave us a comment and let us know where you are tonight. Subscribe if you have not already. There are more stories like this one waiting, and we will see you for the next one.